You will never know what your first relationship truly cost you until years later, when you finally realize what it prevented you from becoming. Not pain, not heartbreak, but arrested development. The invisible ceiling that locked your growth before it ever began. And the worst part? You probably called it love. You thought you had won something, when in reality, you had traded your freedom for comfort. Traded your masculine evolution for emotional anesthesia. This isn't a romantic tragedy. It's a social epidemic. Most men don't fall in love, they fall into dependency. Not because they chose, but because they were chosen. And there's a brutal difference between the two. One is conscious, the other is survival. From the very beginning, society whispers a soft lie into every boy's ear. Find someone who makes you whole. And that one phrase becomes the origin of his downfall. Because the moment a man looks for wholeness in another, especially in a woman, he forfeits the right to build his own. He becomes a boy chasing emotional refuge instead of becoming a man creating emotional gravity. And so begins the cycle. The nice guy who gives too much too soon to someone he barely knows. Because he's never really known himself. You see, the earliest relationships aren't rooted in power. They're rooted in panic. And what looks like romance is often just your trauma dressed in flowers. For most men, the first serious relationship is a mirror of unresolved insecurity. If I hold her, maybe I don't have to face how empty I feel when I'm alone. And society applauds this. Friends cheer you on. Family calls it maturity. No one tells you that what you're calling love might just be emotional escapism. The truth? Early relationships are not always a blessing. Sometimes they are a slow execution. You stop exploring. You stop evolving. You lock yourself in a dynamic you didn't understand, with a person you barely knew, and convince yourself that this is life. Because it's safe. Because it's better than being alone. But isolation isn't the enemy. Comfort is. There's a paradox no one wants to admit. The man who rushes into commitment too early is often the one least capable of sustaining it. Why? Because he hasn't built the emotional range to handle the storms that real intimacy demands. He has no scars. No calibration, no blueprint. He's navigating complexity with the emotional tools of a child. So what does he do? He adapts, he becomes agreeable, he avoids confrontation. He shrinks his identity to protect the relationship, thinking that sacrifice is love when in fact it's self-erasure. And he believes that being chosen is enough. But here's the contradiction. Being chosen early feels like power. But it's not. Real power is in choosing. After you've seen what's out there. After you've seen what's in yourself. After you've rejected and been rejected, not because you're broken, but because you're becoming precise. When a man has only loved one or two women deeply, he thinks love is rare. He thinks connection is divine, mystical, meant to be. But that's not love. That's statistical ignorance. This is why the first heartbreak hurts more than any other. It's not because she was special. It's because you believed she was your only shot at meaning. The pedestal you put her on wasn't about her. It was about how little you had lived before meeting her. That's not love. That's dependency, masquerading as destiny. Let's go deeper. The early relationship becomes a surrogate identity. You stop building your own empire because now your empire is us. You dilute your mission to keep the peace. You tolerate red flags because you fear starting over. You compromise not just your standards, but your direction. And the cost? You lose time. The one currency no one can refund. Time you could have spent developing emotional fluency, learning to speak feminine energy, mastering your own polarity. Time you could have spent falling, bleeding, rising. Not chasing the idea of being a good boyfriend, but becoming a dangerous man who chooses with clarity, not fear. But how can you know what you truly want in a woman if you've only been with one kind? How can you choose your queen if you've never seen the full spectrum of the feminine archetypes that exist? You can't. You're guessing. You're clinging. You're calling home the first woman who gave you warmth without realizing that the warmth may be hiding poison, or worse, stagnation. And here's where the trap tightens. Early relationships become identity anchors. You build years of stories, photos, memories. So even when it's no longer working, you stay. Because the pain of starting over feels greater than the pain of staying stuck. So you tolerate the slow erosion of your masculinity. You stop flirting, you stop leading, you stop risking, you become passive, predictable, emotionally neutered. And then one day, you look in the mirror and realize, you're not a man in love, you're a man who gave up. This isn't bitterness, this is brutal clarity, and it gets worse. Because once you normalize that early dynamic, you carry it into your next relationships. You enter each one still uncalibrated, still inexperienced, still trying to love from the same wounded place, and each time the stakes get higher. The damage gets deeper. You don't get sharper with time, you just get more resigned. Unless you break the pattern, unless you choose discomfort over dopamine, unless you trade early commitment for deep exploration. This is not a call to recklessness. This is a call to rebellion. A rebellion against the cultural script that tells you being a boyfriend at 20 makes you a man. It doesn't. It makes you a boy who found a crutch before he learned how to walk. You need tension. You need contrast. You need to feel the sting of rejection, the confusion of female behavior, the chaos of seduction, not to become manipulative, but to become wise. The kind of wisdom you can't learn on podcasts or pages. The kind that only comes from immersion. From mistakes, from misreading signals, from getting played, from playing, from losing, from leaving. And then one day, you'll sit across a woman and feel nothing but calm. Not because you're numb, but because you've seen too much to be shaken. You'll choose her not because you need her, but because you want her. And that's where the game ends. You will never know what your first relationship truly cost you until years later, when you finally realize what it prevented you from becoming. Not pain, not heartbreak, but arrested development, a potential that was amputated before it even had the chance to take form. And the most dangerous part? You probably called it love. You thought you had won something, when in truth, you traded your masculine edge for emotional anesthesia. What looks like intimacy is often dependency in disguise. What feels like safety is often sedation. And most men never wake up from this. The modern man doesn't fall in love. He falls into survival, into a relationship he didn't choose, but one he clung to because it chose him. And that difference between being chosen and choosing is what defines whether you lead your life or let it be dictated by your fear of being alone. Relationships are sold as emotional upgrades. But for most men, they are exits, ways to avoid becoming who they're meant to be. From an early age, you were trained to associate the feminine with emotional refuge. First as mother, then as girlfriend, then as savior. The problem? No one saves you from the man you never became. Most men enter relationships with zero sexual intelligence, no psychological calibration, and a broken inner compass. They fall in love with the first person who listens, kisses, and stays. Not because it's right, but because it's the first time they felt seen. But validation is not love. Attention is not compatibility. And just because she stays doesn't mean she sees you. In truth, you don't even see yourself yet. And if you haven't seen yourself, you're in no position to choose someone else. But the trap deepens. Early relationships become identity anchors. You don't just date her, you fuse with her. Her presence becomes your ego's shelter. Her validation becomes your compass. And the more time you spend together, the more you convince yourself it's fate. But love built on lack is not love. It's emotional morphine, and it numbs your ability to evolve. She becomes the reason you don't go out, don't explore, don't flirt, don't risk, don't bleed. And worse, you mistake this stagnation for loyalty. You begin to shrink in the name of love. You stop leading, you stop testing your value in the real world. And soon you are no longer a man in love. You are a man who gave up. The problem isn't the relationship. The problem is the timing. You committed before knowing what you're capable of, before learning what seduction really is, before meeting different feminine energies, manipulative, submissive, wild, intuitive, sensual, cold, artistic, spiritual. You only saw one shade of the feminine, and you convinced yourself that was the whole spectrum. That's not loyalty. That's blindness. Without experience, your standards aren't yours. They're just the result of your exposure. You didn't choose her. You settled for what you were offered, because you were afraid that nothing better was coming. But no man should make decisions from that place. Because when you commit early, what you avoid is not heartbreak. What you avoid is refinement. A man who hasn't been through rejection, temptation, chaos, feminine contradiction, and emotional failure is still guessing. And you cannot lead from guesswork. You lead from precision, from pattern recognition, from lessons you earned through blood, not books. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Most early relationships are not romantic, they are regressions, psychological safety nets, and society encourages this, calls it maturity, responsibility, settling down, as if settling was the goal. But masculinity doesn't settle, it sharpens, it expands, it learns, and it chooses only when the choosing is deliberate. The man who never lived enough will always overvalue the first woman who gives him peace. Not because she's right, but because she's rare. Rarity creates illusion. But rarity without context is just ignorance. You can't know what a queen is if you've only dated a peasant. You can't know what integrity is if you've never met deception. You can't recognize softness until you've survived manipulation. You don't know what you need until you've drowned in what you don't. And that's the root of the mistake. We crown the first woman who doesn't hurt us. And we call her the one. Not realizing we're just starving men, calling the first loaf of bread a feast. You don't need to sleep with 100 women. But you need enough volume and contrast to calibrate your radar. To understand what draws you in, what drains you, what excites, what grounds. Experience refines desire. Lack of experience inflates fantasy. So here's the paradox. The man who commits early appears mature. But underneath, he's emotionally underdeveloped, because he hasn't faced enough of the world to choose consciously. Real maturity comes later, when you've said no to beauty, when you've walked away from lust, when you've chosen solitude over emotional sedation. That's when you earn the right to say yes, yes, and know what it costs. Until then, your yes is just fear with flowers on top. So before you move in, propose, or plan your future with someone, ask yourself, is this choice coming from clarity, or from comfort, from power, or panic? Because if you're still afraid to lose her, you haven't lived enough to keep her. And that means you're not choosing her. You're holding on to her like a lifeline. And no relationship born from desperation will survive the storms ahead. The truth no one tells you is this: relationships don't reveal who you are. They reveal what you avoided becoming. Every early commitment is a story of what could have been, not in regret, but in the sharp realization that your edge was dulled too soon. This is not about becoming a player, it's about becoming precise. Because when you've lived, really lived, and you finally sit across from a woman who aligns with your mission, your depth, your instincts, and your integrity, you will feel peace. Not panic. Desire, not dependency. And that's when you know you're no longer a man trying to be loved. You're a man who knows how to choose. You think you're ready for a relationship because you've loved once, maybe twice. You think loyalty is proof of maturity, that the fewer women you've been with, the purer your heart. But the truth is, the man who's only touched a handful of women has no idea what he truly wants, only what he was offered. He doesn't choose his partner. He clings to whoever appeared first and stayed. And that's not love. That's a low sample size, pretending to be destiny. This is the hidden cost. When you haven't tasted variety, you mistake comfort for compatibility. You mistake sexual chemistry for emotional alignment. You mistake her silence for peace, and her attention for love. Because you've never been in enough situations to see the patterns repeat. You don't know what's manipulation versus what's mystery, what's intuition versus what's insecurity. And so you build an entire relationship on assumptions. A man who's been with only a few women lacks contrast. And without contrast, you lack clarity. If all you've ever tasted is sweet, how would you know the value of spice? If all you've ever seen is one archetype of femininity, you will project your fantasy onto her, without realizing she might just be the best of a limited list, not the best for you. That's why so many men fall apart after a breakup. Not because they lost the one, but because they never built the emotional breadth to realize she wasn't. Let's go deeper. Every woman you experience teaches you something about women, but more importantly about yourself. The seductress shows you your lust. The cold one shows your need for validation. The nurturing one triggers your protector. The manipulative one exposes your weakness. Each interaction is not just a conquest, it's a calibration. And the man who hasn't gone through this spectrum is blind to who he becomes in each dynamic. He thinks he's stable, but he's only never been tested. He thinks he's faithful, but he's only never been tempted. He thinks he's emotionally strong, but he's only avoided emotional storms. And when life finally hits, he breaks. because he never rehearsed under pressure. Now, let's add science to this. Studies in behavioral psychology show that romantic idealization is highest in individuals with limited sexual or relational experience. The less experience you have, the more you project. You turn her into a goddess because you lack the data to do otherwise. You romanticize scarcity because that's all you know. And here lies the paradox. The less you live, the more you fantasize. The more you fantasize, the worse your choices. And the worse your choices, the more pain you collect. Not because the world is cruel, but because your lens is too narrow to make refined decisions. Experience isn't about quantity, it's about variation. It's about dealing with different energies. Women who challenge you, soothe you, seduce you, ignore you, test you, admire you, abandon you. You need all of them, not to become a pickup artist, but to build a map, a reference system, so you don't walk into your 30s or 40s still getting emotionally dismantled by the same traps that could have been disarmed in your 20s. But modern culture makes you ashamed of this. It tells you that high body count equals low value, that a man who's explored is broken, that the less you live, the more pure you are. What a dangerous myth. Because purity isn't power. Precision is. And there's no precision without immersion. You don't get calibrated from theory. You get calibrated from the field. And if you've only been with 3 women in your life, what happens when the 4th is toxic and knows how to press your buttons? You won't see her for who she is. You'll see her as an enigma. And by the time you realize she's a storm, your house will already be underwater. Because you never learned how to build walls. You never studied the warning signs. You never got burned enough to know what fire smells like. There's a reason seasoned men are calmer. It's not just age, it's pattern recognition. They've seen it all. They've heard the excuses, felt the highs, survived the betrayals. They know when softness is a weapon, when silence is manipulation, when affection is a tactic, when sex is bait, not because they're cynical, but because they've collected the repetitions. They've trained their nervous system to respond with clarity instead of craving. Contrast that with the average man who's only had 2 girlfriends. Every fight feels existential. Every woman feels like the one. Every problem feels like destiny trying to test him. And so he overcommits, over-explains, over-apologizes, over-invests, and then collapses under the weight of a dynamic he never truly understood. He doesn't need therapy, he needs exposure. Real-life exposure to the chaos and magic of the feminine in all her forms. Now here's the darker twist. When you don't have enough experience, your ego steps in to protect you. It inflates the value of your limited connections. It convinces you that your one serious ex was some kind of soulmate. Why? Because if she wasn't, it means you wasted years. So your pride locks you in a loop, replaying the same story over and over, hoping the meaning will save you from the truth. You didn't know better. You simply didn't know. And this is why most men marry their 3rd or 4th girlfriend, not because she's the perfect match, but because they're tired. Tired of searching, tired of failing, tired of rebuilding. They call it love, but it's just resignation. They build a life with someone not because of shared vision, but because she stayed when others left. That's not partnership. That's settling. Here's the brutal truth. You cannot trust your own taste in women until you've met enough of them to compare. Until you've seen how your body reacts to femininity in its different expressions. Until you've been tempted and rejected and deceived and delighted. Only then do you begin to see the outlines of your true standards. Before that, you're just making decisions from instinct, not insight. Let's break a myth. 100 women is not about numbers. It's about contrast. Volume, exposure, pattern recognition. It's about rewiring your brain so you stop reacting to beauty as if it's rare. You stop collapsing when she withdraws. You stop needing to impress, because you've already impressed enough to know that real power isn't in pursuit, it's in presence. The real purpose of dating many women isn't conquest. It's sovereignty. You learn how not to chase. You learn to lead. You learn when to walk away, not because you're arrogant, but because you finally know what aligns with your core. Each woman teaches you something about your standards. Each failure refines your taste. Each heartbreak stretches your capacity for emotional depth. You don't just become seductive, you become sharp. And sharp men don't fall into love, they build it. Now let's talk about the man you become after you've seen 100 versions of her. You become unshakable. Because now you've slept with the wild one, the cold one, the insecure one, the manipulative one, the nurturing one, the spiritual one, the alpha. You've seen feminine chaos, divine softness, seductive toxicity. You've been rejected after sex, ghosted after passion, idolized by women you didn't want, and dismissed by women you once obsessed over. And you survived. Not just survived, you evolved. And something shifts. You're no longer seeking to be chosen. You're no longer begging to be seen. You stop selling yourself in every conversation. You walk into rooms with a different gravity. Because now, you don't need her to tell you you're enough. You've already proven that to yourself. 100 times. And that's the shift that most men never experience. They commit too early, too hungry, too uncertain, and so their relationships become prisons of regret. They look back and wonder, what if? Not because they wanted more sex, but because they wanted more clarity. And clarity only comes from chaos.